Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And yeah, I decided to do another myths show, although technically maybe not a myths show, maybe more of a clarification show. So a bit of background. November last year, I was in Aachen with a group of friends, and we were speaking English because we were English-speaking people. And people would sometimes say to us, "Are you lot English?" And we would go, "No, because I'm English." But we had an Irishman who sounds English because he was raised in England. We had a Northern Irish chap who is Irish but also British, and we had an Irish chap who is from the British Isles but is not British or English, although he speaks English because he's Irish. Okay. Now, if you're from outside the British Isles or Europe, that may have confused you. Let's go through and make some sense of it, okay? Because this is referring to, you get it in museums in Europe. People will say, the English forces attacked the city, or this is one of the English landing beaches, perhaps in Normandy, or the British army fought through a certain country or campaign. So I'm going to try and explain to you what it all means, okay? So what is meant by the British army? And we're talking, of course, about World War II. So let's start with a geography lesson, okay? So the British Isles, which is a geographic feature, is what we can see on the map there. So the countries that make up Great Britain or United Kingdom, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Wales technically is a principality, but it's also a country. And then you have Ireland or ERA, which has been a separate country for decades. Okay, that's the British Isles. And up in the top right there, the populations of those countries as they were in 1939 and as they were in 2021. And notice how Scotland's population has barely increased in 80 plus years. Britain's has, sort of 40 to 50% larger. And then I've added Ireland in white under there because Ireland didn't come in that same set of data because Ireland is a separate country. Ireland is still part of the EU, whereas Great Britain, United Kingdom, is not part of the EU. It all gets very complicated, but except that, anyway, but we're going into politics now. And in the bottom there, I've added the figure of 50,000 Irish-born men and women who joined the British Armed Forces. So these are people from Ireland, ERA, so the capital of which is Dublin, who chose, even though their country was neutral in World War II, to fight against the Axis forces and enlisted into the British military forces, such as the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the region, okay? So the numbers of people that came from these countries would be pretty much representative of the population. So the same kind of percentages of people would go into the British Army from Scotland as from Wales and from England. So even in 1939, 1940, the British Army was made up of people from various different parts of the British Isles and ancestrally from other parts of the world as well, because Britain never had segregation in World War II. So although the population of non-white British people was pretty low in 1939, places like Liverpool, which is on the west coast there, lots of immigrant population there, some of the places in London. So there are people from Japan and China, the Far East, from parts of Africa, India, and some of these people will be assimilated, either drafted or volunteer to join the British Army. So, for example, a unit that I studied for many years, the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron, who were part of the British 1st Airborne Division, there were 2 or 3 black soldiers within that unit because they were British, they were born in Britain, their parents had emigrated to Britain, and they were part of the British Army. So they are British by birth, they are in the British Army, but they may identify in terms of their culture as something else, okay? And David O'Keefe is making the point about the Empire Army. I like the phrase Duke, which dominions, United Kingdom, and Empire. So that covers people from all around the world. And some more data for you. During the war, the British Empire and Dominions raised a total of 8,586,000 men for military service. There are women involved, but that's not included in that figure. Lots of women as well. 5 million from the British Isles, which would possibly include, depending on how they broke down those statistics, Ireland as well. Then you see there another 1.5 million or so from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc., 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 and the colonies. So even at that point, the British Army is not just British, yet a lot of these forces would be considered to be part of the British Army if they are serving under British command. Where does the difference come from? Where does the complication come from in terms of what we mean by British and English? And so I define myself as English because I am born in England. I now live in France, but I carry a British passport. So I am both English and British. And I also classify myself as a European because I have a carte de séjour, a French license, I suppose, that because I live in France, I'm allowed to be a resident here. So I'm not French, but I'm allowed to live here legally. So I have various different labels I would call myself. Now, the interesting thing is when you get to Europe, and of course, as I said, I live in France, because the French word for English as in the language is anglais. So a British or English person speaks anglais or Canadian, but also speak anglais or maybe French because they may be French Canadian. So the French, the Belgians, Dutch, Germans have sometimes a tendency to refer to British troops or British peoples as English because they use the language title to refer to the people themselves. So there's a distinct difference. So Colin, my best mate I'm going to pub with later on, is Irish by nationality. He speaks English and he's a resident of France. This is where it gets all very complicated, but hopefully you're finding this a bit interesting because I find particularly Americans can get a bit confused about what England is and Great Britain. And we don't make it easy for ourselves in that, for example, when it comes to football or soccer, our countries in Britain play separately. So there's Northern Ireland, Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, but some sports like athletics, we play as Great Britain, so we combine our countries. So it does get a bit complicated. Even the British flag, which has the component parts of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and England, but doesn't have the component part of Wales on it for basically reasons, okay? And we could go into flags and stuff later on. So it is complicated. I'm trying to get through it now. So when we come to World War II, let's take the Welsh units first. So there were lots of Welsh regiments. So Royal Welsh Fusiliers, etc., etc., etc. And for example, this is a photo of Welsh troops in 1940 celebrating St David's Day, so the patron saint of Wales. So there's a woman in traditional Welsh costume there, and they've got leeks under the flaps of their side hats there. So I know people who do study Welsh troops in 1944 in Normandy. So there are Welsh units as part of the British Army here and in Italy. But by 1944, many of the troops within a Welsh regiment, or Scottish or Irish, and we'll get to this later on, are no longer from Wales. Now, in 1939, 1940, when these regiments are raised, they're territorial regiments, some of them, or they're already existing regular units. So a Welsh unit in 1940 or 1939 would comprise lots of Welsh born Welsh identifying soldiers, but with conscription, with the losses, with the fact the British military are fighting on all fronts in World War II, by 1943, 44, and even earlier, there are English guys in Welsh regiments, there are Scots guys in Welsh regiments, etc., etc., etc. So in Normandy, for example, even if you were born and raised in London and you joined a Welsh regiment on St David's Day, you would follow probably Welsh traditions of eating raw leek and all that kind of stuff they do on St David's Day. Now, my own great uncle, who landed on Sword Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944, as the part of the Royal Ulster Rifles, he is from West London. He was English like me. He got a commission in the Territorial Army, went to the London Irish Rifles first, which was essentially a territorial unit traditionally for Irish immigrants from Ireland who were living in London who joined a local territorial unit. My great uncle joined that unit. He then went to the parent regiment, the Royal Ulster Rifles, and commanded troops from Northern Ireland, and some are from Southern Ireland or Eire, and some are from England like him, but they would have identified as a Northern Irish regiment. But my great uncle did not identify himself as being Northern Irish. He remained English in a Northern Irish regiment. I hope this is all making sense, folks. I hope Colin is giving me a big thumbs up, because this is one of the things Colin is always banging on about, what these terms mean: English, Scottish, Welsh, etc., etc. So a Welsh regiment would have Welsh traditions. The regiment is Welsh. They would have some Welsh sort of language traditions, but they could have people from Tyneside, Yorkshire, Glasgow, indeed other parts of the British Isles, or indeed further afield. You could be, for example, a Chinese immigrant who enlisted in Cardiff and you joined a Welsh regiment. So you identify again as being part of a Welsh regiment. Maybe you have British nationality, but you may consider your ancestry to be Chinese or Mandarin or whatever it would be, okay? And here is not an Irish unit. Now, some of this, I'm sure you are watching thinking, we know all this stuff, Woody, why are you telling us this? But some of you will go, I didn't know this stuff. So this is an Irish regiment wearing a corbeen. Now, the corbeen, the distinctive thing about an Irish corbeen is it's pulled down to the left. Berets worn by the British Army, general service caps are normally pulled down to the right. I wear my hats pulled down to the right, but the Irish wear theirs pulled down to the left. So it looks a bit like a Scottish tam o' shanter, but it's actually an Irish corbeen. These are officers of the London Irish Rifles on the left, and there's another guy in the London Irish Rifles, and there was an Irish brigade. We've talked about it on the channel, the 38th Irish Brigade, who fought as part of the 78th Infantry Division in Tunisia and Italy and what have you. And again, they would have Irish traditions. They would have Irish pipers. They would adopt and follow Irish customs and traditions. And men joining it would feel an Irish identity, but they may not have come from Ireland, Northern Ireland or Ireland. They may, as I say, like anybody else, come from Yorkshire or Newcastle or Dorset or whatever. So that's an Irish regiment. And an Irish regiment can mean either Northern Irish or comprising of people from Northern Ireland and Southern Irish. And Ireland, of course, had its own army, although they, as a neutral nation, they didn't participate in World War II. But you can be in the Irish army today in 2023 and have nothing to do with the British Isles because you're from Ireland. Is this all making sense? I hope it's making sense. And this here is photos of Scottish units. So again, this is, I think, Gordon Highlanders on the left there in Tunis, so in 1943, 42, 43. And I think that's 15th Scottish units, a unit in Normandy there, so they've got the piper there. So again, in 1939-40, these regiments, particularly the territorial battalions or those that had strong connections to places in Scotland, so for example, Glasgow or Edinburgh or Aberdeen, the Highlands, the Lowlands. You may have watched the show recently with Andy Aitchison about the Jocks, part of the 52nd Lowland Division fighting in Germany. So a lot of the traditions, again, would be Scottish, Scottish jokes, Scottish culture, Scottish kind of mess dinners. But by 1944, you could be from anywhere within a Scottish regiment. It's just how it worked. The Irish Guards, for example, in 1944, who are part of 30 Corps pushing towards the bridges, Operation Market Garden, they had a draft in of people from the RAF regiment who weren't Irish, and they weren't technically tall enough to be guards because you had to be a certain height to be a guard. Basically, by midway through the war, the rules go out the window because there's a manpower shortage. Okay, so there's a Scottish unit. And those ones on the left, the ones at the front with like the dicing, the red and white dicing there, that is a Glengarry cap, primarily worn by officers and NCOs, but also enlisted men as well could wear them. And the guys in the rear, the second row, are wearing tam o' shanters, the Scottish version. So it has a little kind of a bobble on the top, like a bobble hat, and that identifies it as Scottish. If I flick back to the Irish, so theirs pulled down to the left. The Scots pull theirs down to the right because that's the tradition within a Scottish regiment. Okay, I hope this is all making sense to you guys. And these are two examples of English regiments. Again, their origins, their traditions are from English counties. So on the left there, I put that in for Colin, the Durham Light Infantry. So this is where Colin gets complicated. I love Colin because one of his favourite regiments is the Durham Light Infantry from the northeast of England, because that's where Colin grew up. That's where he played football, in Sunderland. So he identifies geographically to the northeast of England, where he spent much of his boyhood and youth, and yet he defines himself as an Irishman because that's where he was born, and yet he has a Welsh mother, just to add a bit of complication to it. On the right there is a member of the Devonshire Regiment from the 50th Division, and for example, you get the 43rd Wessex Division, who are mostly from the West Country. Again, traditionally, in terms of their recruiting, they're men from Devon and Dorset and Cornwall and Somerset and Wiltshire. But again, by 1944, there'd be people from the East End of London in part of the Wessex Division, people from Scotland, people from wherever. When you were called up, you were put where it was needed. That's where it went. Okay, so as I said there, the actual makeup of any English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish units would be from all over the British Isles and indeed beyond. You could come from anywhere. You could be a Dutchman. In terms of your parents being Dutch, maybe your parents emigrated to work in the cotton mills or something, and you have been born in Britain, so you technically hold a British passport, but you might identify yourself as being Dutch because that's what you speak at home with your parents, but you are still within a Scottish, Irish, Welsh, or otherwise unit. Okay. Now let's make it even more complicated. Now let's go out to Burma and the 14th Army. That's the insignia of the 14th Army out there with General Bill Slim, William Slim commanding it. So we would often say things like, so the British Army fought in Burma. And the British Army did fight in Burma. But the 14th Army, which had 4 corps at various times attached to it, and they shuffled around a bit because the 14th Army was around for several years. That list of units there on the right is the list of divisions that were part of the 14th Army. So if we look at that, 1 British at the top, and the rest are Indian or East African or West African. There are also other units as well that are smaller brigade and regiment-sized units of all sorts there. So 80% or more of the British 14th Army, labelled British because it's commanded by a British general and it works under British doctrine, British command, British structure, is actually not British at all. Non-white, not necessarily English speaking by birth. You're from West Africa, you're from India, you're from Nepal, you're from somewhere else there, because there are Gurkhas as part of Indian divisions as well, which complicates the matter even more. And good point in there, Sheldrake, there are Canadian Canloan officers commanding platoons and companies within the British Army who have a Canada soldier flash, but they are now an officer within the Argyll and Southern Highlanders or the Wiltshire Regiment, whatever it would be. So if they were asked in the pub and they weren't keeping things secret for security reasons, so who are you, mate? So I'm Canadian, I'm from whatever, I'm from Toronto. Who are you serving with? I am serving with the Wiltshire Regiment. He wouldn't identify as being English, but he would identify as serving with an English regiment, but he himself is Canadian, okay? And to further muddy the water, okay, let's think about the famous classic film Zulu with Stanley Baker and Michael Caine, where they sing Men of Harlech, the defenders of Rorke's Drift, towards the Zulus there, because we've come to believe there's a big Welsh aspect, the story of Rorke's Drift. In actual fact, about 20% of the guys at Rorke's Drift were Welsh. It was because the regiment, its lineage continued to be a Welsh regiment, but at the time, I think half of them are from Lincolnshire or something like that. So we have these ideas about the identity of units based on the misuse sometimes of language, the misuse of terms. And we could get into the fact that some Dutch people I know, I'm going into continental Europe now, don't mind us Brits referring to the Netherlands as Holland, and other people say no, Holland is only a region within the Netherlands, and they liked it to be the Netherlands. And yet sometimes Dutch people will introduce themselves as saying I am from Holland. It comes down a lot to personal preference, but I thought you'd like that breakdown there of the 14th Army. And just to give you an idea of who made up the 14th Army, there are your Indian troops with various types of turbans and traditional uniform items, West Africans down there at the bottom, etc., etc., etc. So hopefully that has cleared up a little bit about what the hell we mean when we say the British Army. The British Army is a holding word, a collective noun for a much more complicated system below that. Okay, so if you hear someone, if you're watching this and you're from North America, because even American doesn't necessarily mean that you're from the USA, because American means anybody from the American continent technically. So if you're from Peru, you're technically American because you're from South America, but we have come to understand the word American meaning as the USA. So you see how complicated it gets, folks? Do you see how language gets very interpretative, and you can classify things based on different things? So basically what I'm saying to you is to round this off is that if you read about an English unit attacking on one of the beaches on D-Day, or you hear about a Scottish unit making an attack somewhere, that isn't a complete definition of who that unit actually comprises. It is a Scottish regiment, has its connections, origins, and traditions with Scotland, but can be made up from people all over the British Isles. And as we said there to Sheldrake, officers within a British unit can even be Canadian, so they're not even British at all, and they're commanding an English, Welsh, Scottish, or Northern Irish unit. So there we are. Scott Grimwood says it's clear as mud. Well, hopefully it hasn't been that unclear. You can always watch it again, watch the show again, and we could do a whole show on the headgear worn by British Army units. That could take hours just to go through all the solar topies and the side hats and GS caps and chip bags and berets and general service caps. And that's before you even start talking about the people from outside of the UK. Again, the West Africans, East Africans, Indians, who have a whole array of different types of headgear. And yes, so this, Maria, good point there. There were Gurkhas serving in the British Army in World War II and prior to World War II, and there were Gurkhas serving in the Indian Army. And at various points in the history of that part of the world, there were Gurkhas fighting against each other because some were serving with the British Crown and some were serving with other. It gets very complicated. So yes, Gurkhas can and often and traditionally and today serve with the British Army. I've had a privilege in my life, my time of getting to know a few Gurkhas, and they're incredible soldiers. We all know that. We've done a show on World War II TV about Gurkhas in the British Army. So there we are. So the English Army isn't necessarily a thing. The British Army is a thing, but it's not quite as neat as we think it is. And just bear in mind those nuances when you're reading about the British Army. And I could do another one of these shows at some point. And if you think this is a good idea, they put a thumbs up in the comments now about American divisions, because American divisions have often connections to particular regions. The 29th Division, famously the blue and the gray from Maryland, DC, Virginia. But that doesn't mean everybody in the 29th Division is one of those states. You can have a guy from California in the 29th Division. You have the tough hombres of the 90th Division, TNO, Texas, Oklahoma. They are not all from that part of the world. So it gets very, very complicated with this history. So there we are. I'll leave it at that. It's a complicated history. Hopefully you found that really interesting. This is what we're doing on these myth shows. I will see you all next time. I'm off to the pub later on. Cheers. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to click and like and subscribe. Thanks, everybody. Bye.